Everybody, welcome back. And please give a warm welcome to Academy Award nominated screenwriter Krysty Wilson-Cairns and Edgar Wright.
Thank you. Thanks for coming out, everybody.
Yes, at a 10 a.m. screening. You were concerned about a 10 a.m. screening?
No, I just thought, I said, that's a good movie to watch at 10 in the morning. Wake you up. That'll wake you up. Especially in Dolby Atmos.
And Dolby Vision as well. I right off the bat, to the two of you, the fact that so much is told in this movie by movement and light, as opposed to being told things by words. I'm talking specifically the scene where Eloise goes into the Café de Paris. Can you talk about to the audience about creating that scene where it tells us so much visually and movement-wise?
Well, I guess a big part of that kind of conception of those sequences was the idea of like that she's seeing, you know, kind of these visions in dreams, and in dreams, the way that, you know, you see and hear things, or even who you are or what you look like or whose body you're in, kind of keep sort of changing. So that was a big part of it for me in terms of the original conception of the idea of, you know, you're going back to the 60s, but you're not time traveling like Marty McFly. You're going back in dreams, and as such, you know, the sort of, I don't know if, I certainly have dreams where I am somebody else in a dream, or at some point I'm in somebody else's body. And so it was that kind of thing of just, you know, the kind of perspective keeps changing. And it's interesting you mentioned the color as well, because that was also one of the big things about it, is like the early scenes in contemporary London, the sort of color palette is more muted, you know, like London is sort of cold and unfriendly. Right. And then when you go to the 60s, it's like, you know, Technicolor, like, and then in the sort of midpoint of the movie, when things are starting to take a turn and the past is starting to invade the present, like it's like the colors start to seep into the modern world as well. That was always the kind of like, if you're doing like the 3-act structure with color, that was basically the idea.
And you know, Krysty, Academy Award nominated in 1917. You know, here's another script that we find out things through movement. We find out things about the characters through action. And in this film, we have a similar situation where we find out about Eloise and Sandy's relationship, and the character of Sandy is fleshed out in the 60s, but it's all through movement. Can you talk about that from a script point of view?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the really nice things about working with fantastic directors is that you can trust them to get the performance, you can trust the actors to act, and you can trust them to deliver the intent. As long as it's there in the script and it's there in the conversations that you have, those excellent people will get it across. So yeah, it makes my job really easy.
You actually worked at the Toucan, right?
Yes.
And how did your experiences of living and working in Soho infuse the script?
Well, when I first met Edgar, it was actually the night of Brexit, which I love to constantly remind myself. And we were drowning our sorrows. Sam Mendes introduced us. He was like, you'll get on like a house on fire.
It's a stress that we wanted to remain in Europe.
We very much love Europe. But sadly, we're ripped out of it. Anyway, not to get too political. But we were meeting at the Dean Street Townhouse, and I happened to mention, I was like, oh, by the way, that strip club over there, I used to live above it, and it was really loud. And then I worked at the bar around the corner. And I think I maybe was still doing shifts when I first met you, because I really loved that job, because I got to drink for free. And Edgar was like, oh, so you're like a Soho person as well. And so we were kind of like, you know, bonding over that. And he said, you know, I have an idea. It's all set in Soho. It's about this young girl in Soho. Can I tell it to you? Yes, of course you can. So we went on like another kind of pub crawl night out, and we ended up in this dingy basement bar, and he told me the story that, you know, became the movie Last Night in Soho. And I knew when I was hearing it, there was so much that resonated with me, like being a young girl, moving to London, you know, coming to the big city. And I think I added the bar stuff. I think that was like one of my notes. I was like, you know, she'll be poor, because I was very poor and needed my bar job, but it's somewhere else to go at night, and it's another experience to engage with that kind of side of Soho. So yeah, there's lots of me in the film, and then lots of you as well, because you're not a young girl, but you did move to Soho.
No, I mean, that's the thing is, I had the idea, I had the story worked out, and in fact, I pitched it and even started development 10 years ago. And initially, me and I told it to Naira Park and Rachel Pryor, my producers, and then we went initially to Film 4, and Tessa Ross was in charge of Film 4 at the time. So, and I did 2 movies in the interim. So the first thing that we did was started researching the movie. I wasn't about to write it, but I really wanted to start developing it. So the first thing we did was hire this amazing researcher, Lucy Pardy,
The Rocks,
who just won a BAFTA for casting director as Rocks, the first BAFTA for casting directing. And she sort of researched every aspect of it, because there was my perception of, like, you know, Soho is a place that fascinates us both, but in the 27 years I'd lived in London, I'd spent so much time in Soho, and I had my perception about it, but I wanted to kind of actually research it with some, you know, real, like, first-hand testimonials, which she did. So I had this kind of phone book, like, tome of, like, amazing and sometimes deeply harrowing research. And then, you know, I was making other movies, and I knew I wanted to make this movie, and there was always something kind of like you know, and meeting Krysty was sort of, I think, the last piece of the puzzle, is that we met when I was editing Baby Driver, and like Sam Mendes had introduced us, and he said, he hadn't introduced us in terms of us working together, he just said, you guys are getting like a house on fire. Spoiler alert. So that was the thing, like, so when we had that meeting, I was like, I think maybe subconsciously I knew where it was going. First it was like telling her the whole plot, like, as a sounding board, and then eventually like calling her and saying, should we write the screenplay together? So it's something that had been gestating for a long time. And then the nice thing about it is that we do bring our shared experiences to it. Because I'm not an 18-year-old girl from Cornwall, but like I moved from that area to London. My mother is very similar to Eloise in a lot of ways. I think when she watched it the other day, I think she thought it was like a documentary. I mean, I will say the supernatural element, these are all things that are like just kind of like sort of, you know, everyday occurrences to me growing up with my mother is very supernaturally switched on and is the kind of person who feels presences and sees ghosts. And I'm not a skeptical person. And if anything, maybe as a young genre fan, I was envious that my mum had seen a ghost and I hadn't. But, you know, it is amazing. That's what's great, like working with Krysty is like, not just as a great writer, but it's amazing when you have experiences that are totally different. I don't have the experience of being a young woman working in London, but it's amazing what shared experience we had as well. And it's like my mum and your mum and our grandmothers all had some kind of experience with like either like designing clothes or sort of studying fashion or being seamstresses. It runs through both of our families. Even my sister-in-law came from Cornwall to London and studied fashion at art college. So like, there's a lot of, you wouldn't think it with a movie like that, but there is a lot of personal stuff that comes into it. Mm-hmm. And that's the great thing when you already have the story, but as a screenplay, it's like, you know, and maybe some of the most disturbing dialogue in the film is things that have been said to our faces. So, you know, in different contexts and stuff. So that's what, you know, is amazing about a collaboration is that you can imbue even something fantastical like this with a lot of life experience.
Krysty, there is so many, you guys, there is all the 60s cinema that influenced the film, but most of those films were written by male, and there's always this cautionary tales about fallen women in London, but you went against those tropes. You know, can you talk about how you guys approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was in the story before I ever got there, because I think Edgar's an incredibly empathetic filmmaker and understands what it's like in other people's point of views. And those films are always very much like, young girl, plucky girl comes to London, she's got a big dream. How dare you have a big dream, young girl, and now something terrible will happen to you. Which I think is not fair and not relevant and was a bit sort of morality police back in the time. And it was never something that like Edgar or I would have been interested in making. But it was amazing to watch those films to see the locations, because Soho is so rarely on screen. It's very hard to shoot there. You know, it's like, a square mile in the middle of London. You've seen it. It just looks like that. And it's almost a disaster to kind of try and do anything in it, partly because it's the centre of the nightlife. So you should tell the stories about just the people, at the edges of the frame trying to invade the 60s, the modern drunkards. But yeah, so it's like having all those kind of, experiences building towards it. Yeah, it was great. I mean, I kind of feel like those films of the 60s, the best thing that they gave me was the sort of palette and the colour and to see that world. And one of the best things for me was there was a Pathy newsreel that was just a car driving through 60s Soho, just seeing women on the street, how they moved around, how they conducted themselves, how they dressed. And that, to me, was sort of more informative than any of those films.
Edgar, you cast Terrence Stamp, Diana Rigg. Tell us about
Rita Tushingham as well.
Oh, yes. Tell us about the importance of bringing actors from the era to suffuse your story.
Well, it's funny. It wasn't necessarily even. I don't think necessarily I had thought specifically about doing that, because I ended up with like a kind of murderer's row of 60s icons in the three of them. But it was more the thing that when you're writing, you think, who'd be great doing this? Terrence Stamp. And then Terrence Stamp is available and wants to do it, and so why wouldn't you? And as I remember when we talked about Diana Rigg doing it, and before she had read it, we all said, wouldn't that be amazing? And then she wants to do the movie. And then even like Rita Tushingham, I mean,
Margaret Nolan as well.
Margaret Nolan, who does a brief cameo, is also sadly no longer with us. But Rita, I thought, like her playing the grandmother is like, Rita Tushingham was 18 when she made A Taste of Honey, which is one of the great films of the 60s.
She plays the grandmother, by the way.
And, and Thomasin McKenzie is 18 years old. So there was something that I think this is like perfect casting of like, so Rita Tushingham was 18 when she made Taste of Honey. Thomasin McKenzie's 18 making this. And just seeing the two of them together just like made so much sense in terms of they both come from, naturalistic films as well. Taste of Honey, and even Thomasin McKenzie, I'm sure you saw in Leave No Trace, being amazing. But yeah, it was just, and the great thing as well with somebody like Diana, like, is this that they kind of, I think those actors, they all have kind of complicated relationships with being 60s icons. Like Rita did an interview in The Guardian the other day where she said, well, I don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm a 60s icon. That would be ridiculous. It's difficult for them to be objective about it. But of course, they had sort of perspectives on what was in the script, and that was like fascinating. And, somebody like Diana was just like such a joy to work with. And, this is her final screen role. It was just, I think we both had this feeling like if we were doing like a rehearsal, even when she's doing a take, you start to have this out-of-body experience where you forget that you're working, you forget that you're on set, or that, you're just like, Diana Rigg is talking, and it was just magical. And she was so kind of like locked into it in a way that was just like so exciting for us, because the first time I met her, she said, I read the script and I'd love to do it. And then she said, some people are scared by dark material, but I'm not. I love the dark stuff. And I was thinking, this is going to be great.
And how speaking about Diana, she must have witnessed the Café de Paris and Soho in its heyday. Did she have any input to you about?
Yeah, I mean, that is what's amazing in terms of like, I'll tell two stories. Like I showed it to Rita Tushingham the other day, and obviously Rita isn't in the 60s scenes, she's in the modern bits. But she watched it and she was like, my first question for somebody who was there was like, how are the 60s bits? Did we do it right? And she goes, oh God, no, it was good. And she was saying like, that she thought that, the sort of what was going on in the business at that point, which was all sort of like everybody knew about it. And it was like, unfortunately, there was a lot of exploitation going on. And she said that they used to have a code like amongst actresses of DOM, dirty old man. Like, watch out for him, he's a DOM. So like those scenes where like Matt Smith is sort of, coercing like Anya's character to go and have a drink with this kind of, sort of, you don't know whether he's a producer or some showbiz type. It's not important exactly what he does. It's just like, he's a man of influence. So there was that, and then Diana, like, So the Café de Paris scene, Café de Paris, if you don't know, is a real location, and it's actually just recently closed during the pandemic, which hopefully it will reopen because in 3 years it's its centenary. So it's like sitting there like the Mary Celeste right now, completely empty. And people do use it as a location, but because we had a lot of, in that set piece, there's a lot of complicated things going on choreography-wise, and that we ended up making it as a set instead. Marcus Rowlands, the production designer, did an amazing Café de Paris set. So one day I was rehearsing with Diana Rigg on a Saturday, and I happened to mention that the Café de Paris set was right there. And she said, oh, I went to the Café de Paris on my 18th birthday to see Shirley Bassey's first London gig. I was like, oh my God. So I said, oh, do you want to see the set before you go home? So, you know, walking through an empty soundstage is kind of magical enough in its own right. So imagine like walking through that soundstage with Dame Diana Rigg on your arm, and we walked into the Café de Paris empty and dark, and she goes, oh, yes, this is marvelous. This looks exactly like it did. She goes, oh, tell your production designer he did an amazing job. And then there's like this ... the ellipses. And this is always something that I think when you talk to people is there's the kind of like, much like the film, the sort of the glamorous part, and then. And then she just said she was looking at the stairs, and she said, I remember walking down those stairs and lots of roomy-eyed men looking me up and down and feeling like a piece of meat. And I just like was driving home, and I was thinking, well, I don't think she meant to kind of sum up the entire movie, but she did. I don't think she was saying that in respect to the script. It was just the memory that she had. It was like the initial memory of something glamorous and alluring, and then the darker side.
Krysty, this film from the get-go, we're off balance from an audience point of view, visually and everything. But from the script point of view, how were you able to, create that atmosphere that we're completely off balance throughout the entire script?
Well, I mean, I think when you're writing, you should try and really feel the character, and everything about that should echo the character's inner journey. And so, like, Ellie is incredibly off balance. When you meet her, she's moving to the big city for the first time. I don't know how many of you have done that, but it's quite off-balancing. And it's scary, and it's new, and it's like, you go to college. I went to film school. You went to film school as well, or art school. And it's not necessarily the friendliest environment when you first arrive, like Country Mouse, and it's everything about that kind of spins you out, and it's just creating in the script a sense of uneasiness that builds on that. And she doesn't really understand her gift. No one's ever been around to say, oh, this is what you can do and this is why you can do it. So she becomes a sort of unreliable narrator in that sense. What she sees, everything's a bit dreamlike. Is it dream? Is it real? So everything just needs to focus in on that and build to that. And that's, ultimately all you're doing is serving the character.
Mm-hmm. Edgar, I have to ask you about the Wizard of Oz moment where Dorothy opens the door and it's all bright colors, which is Eloise arriving to the Café de Paris. How complicated was it from your point to create that scene? In particular, I love the fact that through movement, dance, through the mirrors, everything, not only do you establish the rules of the game, that this is the way she leaps into her dreams, but also the relationship between Sandy and Eloise is established through movement and dance.
Before I answer that, I just want to tell you my Wizard of Oz theory, because I always thought about that transition from Kansas to Oz, black and white into color, that it's amazing. Well, who's the only person who's not impressed by that? Toto, because dogs see in black and white. So Toto's like, what's the big deal? I just thought like her dog is like nonplussed by that transition. But yes, in this, like the idea was like, I mean, in a similar way to what you were just talking about, the whole idea is like you see the entire movie through Eloise's eyes. And so you're experiencing it through her, and that was really the thing of just like those shots of, to still do as much of it in unbroken shots as possible so you kind of feel like you are there. And like, I mean, the first part of that shot, is one of the most ambitious location shots in the movie, because that was shot in the center of London, in the Haymarket, which is one of the busiest streets in London. And a location, we had an amazing location manager, Camilla Stevenson. we had to give 5 months notice for that shot. Because it's the center of London, and yes, you can get road closures, but you can only get it on a Sunday night between 10:30 p.m. and 2:30 a.m., and you have to leave one lane open for modern buses and ambulances and fire engines. So even though you've got period extras and cars, and we redress the streets, you know, it's still like you're a white knuckle ride getting that shot. So that was amazing in itself, doing that first bit. And then there's some things going on, before we get to the choreography, there's even a crazy thing going on. I don't know if you notice with the Dolby Atmos, but like the surrounds don't kick in until the 60s.
Correct. Everybody, for the first 15 minutes of the film, you were listening in mono. By the time she arrives and crosses the street with the Thunderball poster, then it kicks into full stereo.
Well, this is maybe getting too techie, but I think you'll appreciate it. But like, one of the things we did is that we had the Cilla Black song, You're My World, playing, which was produced by George Martin. And we were trying to figure out, that track just exists. It's not, these days, like, you know, you can get tracks with stems and you can separate it and, you know, do Dolby 7.1 updates, but not with tracks that are just, that's all they have. So Stephen Price, the composer, and Julian Slater, the sound mixer, they came up with an idea, was like, why don't we get an orchestra to record You're My World to go in tandem with the song? So at that point with the Atmos, and also the point where you see Cilla Black on stage singing it for real, you can kind of like bring that track in sync with the original Cilla Black track. So there's sort of two things playing at once. And then the crazy part of that is when we had the orchestra, we recorded our score in Abbey Road in Studio One, where George Martin and Cilla Black actually did that track. Crazy. So that was like really crazy. It's like, we're in the same room, guys, you know. Then to get into the choreography stuff, I mean, I think the stuff with the mirror sequences in that part, and also the dance sequence in the Café de Paris, and this continues through the movie, what you're seeing for the most part is stuff that's like, we kind of use every trick in the book, but a lot of the most impressive shots, I think, are ones that are actually in camera. That what you're looking at is almost like a 21st century update of like the shot in Duck Soup. It's like the two actresses are mirroring each other. I'll give you one kind of like, in the first shot that you see when Thomasin comes down the stairs into the lobby, and she sees the maitre d', who's played by Oliver Phelps, and you see Oliver Phelps in the mirror. Then when he walks in front of the camera to take her coat off, the mirror slides back and reveals the other set where Anya Taylor-Joy is standing with James Phelps, the maitre d's identical twin brother, playing the maitre d' on the other side. This is like magic circle stuff I shouldn't be telling you. David Copperfield would be furious with me right now. So then basically when they're walking up to each other and mirroring each other, that's just a real shot. The two actresses are looking at each other. And the key thing there was like, you can, with the choreography, it feels so much more immersive if you do that. But also for the actresses, if ever you do something in two passes or separating, it's not as immersive for them. Like, you get better performances out of them. And I think what's interesting in the movie is I think Thomasin and Anya are like a sort of a duo throughout the entire movie, right, where they're joined at the hip, but they don't have any dialogue together until like the final scene. You know, but in making the film, they're like sisters that are joined at the hip because they literally have to mirror each other a lot of the time. So when they're, you know, there, like, there's no glass there. When they tap the glass, they're tapping each other's fingers. And then, you know, the digital wizards do some clever things where they put like a bevel or they put like a fingerprint on afterwards. So we did lots of that stuff throughout. The scene when they're dancing on the dance floor where they keep switching is basically like an unbroken take. And it's just, you know, it's essentially a dance between, you know, brilliant choreography by Jennifer White. And, you know, it's basically like, there's 4 performers in that shot. It's like you got Matt Smith, Thomasin McKenzie, Anya Taylor-Joy, and the Steadicam operator, Chris Baines. And like, we got him into all rehearsals. We always saying it's always the mistake that people make with those shots is that the line producer says, do you really need the camera operator in the rehearsal? It's like, yes. And so because he has to be in exactly the right place at the right time. So we just rehearse those, you know, pieces as like dance moves where the camera operator is one of the dancers, essentially.
And when I watch that sequence, and I've seen it a few times now, I kept thinking about Matt Smith, who is, so you have the reality of
the shot stands and falls on what he's doing.
Exactly. I mean,
he felt a lot of pressure doing that.
Because he's like you have the Eloise and Sandy situation happening, but he's dancing with Sandy, but he has to have been aware the fact that Eloise was part of the shooting as well.
Yeah, it's amazing even to me, like watching it. Like what's interesting is I think sort of it was actually there was one point where we were going to shoot it with like sort of the Thomasin was going to be in the same costume as Anya. And we'd even got her in that dress and the same hair and everything. And it was funny, I had a rehearsal video where we had it with the stand-ins. One of whom was a brunette and one was a blonde. And I remember showing that to somebody, and they saw one of the transitions. They went, holy shit, what just happened? Like the brunette turned into the blonde. And it was that moment thing I said, Thomasin has to stay brunette in that sequence. Otherwise, it's going to be so slick, you might not even notice what's going on. So then it was like, I had to say to Adele Dix Moreau, our amazing costume designer, saying, we're not going to use that costume in this bit. She has to stay in her pajamas and with her brown hair, because otherwise I think you won't quite see the magic. But it was amazing doing those shots, and I think sort of it is a real. There's lots of things. If you watch it a second time as well, like, I don't know if you notice that like Matt Smith is in kind of cahoots with the other guy that he punches out, because later on you see him like laughing and slipping him a tenner. But if you also watch that shot, Matt Smith at one point winks to somebody off camera, which is him. So that guy's waiting in the wings so they can start an altercation, and Matt can pretend to be the White Knight and, defend her honor. But you see him winking to that guy off camera.
But I mentioned earlier that one of the many things I admire about that scene is the fact that you set the rules of the game. It's like, this is the way that she leaps into this world, but also you establish the relationship at the same time between the two women, and it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, we sort of worked a lot on the kind of, even in something that works in sort of dream or nightmare logic, we sort of thought about the way that things progress, not just the color thing, but even at the halfway point when the past starts to come into a present, you notice that then Sandy and Jack are looking at Eloise. So now in this first half of the movie, she's like the voyeur, and now it feels in the second half of the movie they're on to her. Now they're sort of they're invading the present and they're looking at her. So you don't see them kind of like acknowledging Eloise until the second half.
And Krysty, crazy question, but it's something when I watched the film, was it, from your point of view, writing the script, you needed the reality to be based on the dream, or for the dream to be based on reality?
Well, you're kind of like trying to pedal two bikes at once a bit with that. So when you're starting that, develop it, you want to start them off in a very same position. They've both just arrived, they both have a dream, they both build this, and then just let those forks like bifurcate. And then, yeah, it was a real tightrope act getting like how much time to spend in the 60s, and that's really what we spent a lot of time working on in the first draft of the script, was like, is there enough 60s, is there too much? Would you rather be there than here, and try and keep that balance?
The first time we see Eloise is with that newspaper dress. Can you tell Krysty about the importance of having her dance around in that newspaper dress?
Yeah. I mean, I dance around in my room when I'm alone, and I assume other people do as well. And I also think, like, I remember being, 18, 19, like, ready to go off to London and kind of imagining these scenarios in my head and who I'd be and how cool I'd be, and it didn't happen. But I always sort of thought that idea of play acting is like very universal and something we all secretly do, right? And the newspaper dress actually came from my great-gran was a seamstress, and she didn't have a lot of money, so she used to cut patterns out of newspaper and pin them to my gran and my mum, and there's all these pictures of my mum in these elaborate ball gowns that are just newspaper, and it always really stayed with me as like such an amazing image. And I thought, well, obviously she's a fashion student, so she would know how to do that, but you start off thinking, like, what is this silhouette? It's like, where it's some amazing nightclub or some amazing party, full-length gown, and then the lights come on, and it's like, a dingy upstairs attic in your grandmother's house, and your dress is paper. And so that's where you start, Eloise, and it was special to me, and I think it works for her character.
There's also that thing in that sequence as well of, like, it's very deliberate that there's the posters for Breakfast at Tiffany's and Sweet Charity on the walls, because in a way I think sometimes you have people that maybe have Holly Golightly on their wall without ever having seen the film or even thinking about the darker elements of that film or the book itself. And so that's the thing where something has sort of been reduced to the surface gloss of like, oh, this image, this cool poster to put on my, in my bedroom without actually, the actual film itself has darker elements. So it's kind of a bit of a tell for what's coming later, and Sweet Charity as well, of course.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of costumes, Edgar, there is a progression in the characters in the story vis-a-vis the costumes and the colors, where we originally see Sandy in the tent dress is pink and bright, and as the movie progresses, starts getting darker. Eloise as well, she, her makeup starts getting darker, her clothes start getting darker. Can you talk about that progression?
Yeah, well, we worked really closely, like, not just with Adil Dix-Moreau, who did the costumes, and Lizzie Giorgio, who did the hair and makeup, but also with my production designer, Marcus Rowlands, and with Chung Chung-hoon, the cinematographer, that to sort of have this kind of, like, the way the color palette progresses. And obviously, you start in that first kind of, like, super glamorous kind of, like, sequence with those colors, and then things start to kind of degrade. And even just the kind of even with some of the vintage dresses get kind of like cheaper as it goes along. Obviously, once Sandy's in kind of like the basement club, she's wearing 60s dresses, but it's getting it's more the kind of off the rack sort of stuff at the time. So we worked really hard on that, and I like the idea that obviously you can kind of chart the entire movie in terms of what Thomasin McKenzie looks like. It's always amazing to me to sort of get to the end of the movie, and if you see the first scene again and just see how much she changes, like in the film, is just astonishing. And in a weird way, it's that strange thing. I can't, like, Thomasin McKenzie, like I said, was 18 when she made it, and she came to London to make the movie. And I feel like her coming to London to making the movie and Eloise coming to London to study at college sort of become, intertwined forever. And in her head as well, And
it's so rare to have an 18-year-old being played by an 18-year-old. And
yeah, I mean, she's astonishing. And, like, so just to do what she does, she's such a sort of I wouldn't say she's like a method actor, but she really wants to kind of be in the zone and really feel it, and to do that and do all the technical stuff as well, or the choreography. It's incredible. I mean, I sort of knew that she could. It wasn't something where I ever doubted her. It was something where, and I think sort of she appreciated that I never questioned whether she could do it or not. I just thought, you're amazing. I think you're going to be fine.
No, but Anya Taylor-Joy was supposed to play Eloise originally, right?
Yeah, was she... Anya Taylor-Joy was the first actor that I ever talked to about the movie. I was on the Sundance jury in 2015 when The Witch won Best Director, and even though I hadn't written a word of the screenplay yet, I had the story, and I remember watching The Witch and thinking, she should be the lead of my Soho movie. And then I met her for coffee. This is in 2015, so this is 6 years ago now. And I met for coffee in Los Angeles, and I wasn't planning. It was like a general meeting. I wasn't planning to, but I ended up, not dissimilar to Krysty in the basement bar. I told her the entire plot of the movie, and she sat there and she went, whoa, I want to be in that film. So originally I was thinking that she should play Eloise. But then over the next 3 years, which was before we started writing the screenplay, I had seen her in other movies, and I had seen her maybe not play that character already, but go on that journey. And then as we were writing the screenplay, one of the big things that happened when we wrote the screenplay was that the Sandy character started to expand, and those 60 scenes started to get bigger. And at the same time, I was seeing Anya in other movies like Split or Thoroughbreds, and then started to think, and also even just seeing her on the red carpet and in fashion magazines, I was like thinking, Anya should play Sandy. And I think I knew she could sing, or she told me I didn't know how well she could sing. I didn't know she was like a knockout singer. But so I was a bit nervous when I sent Anya the script, because you're sending her the script, but not with the part that you originally talked about. So I sort of sent it to her and said, I'd like you to actually look at Sandy. And luckily she said, oh, I would love to do this, and I would love to play Sandy. I mean, she's brilliant in that part. And it is something where it was sort of a big inspiration for that role. Not necessarily the character, but it's that thing of having that kind of like wow star power of like Julie Christie and Darling, where you watch that movie and you're like, oh my God, like an incandescent star. It's undeniable. So having Anya be that part was like perfect.
Mm-hmm. Krysty, music is such an important part of the movie. I'm Your World, Downtown, the soundtrack that we hear. Was all built into the script from the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the soundtrack actually predates the script. So when I signed on, Edgar sent me the research book, a bunch of DVDs, and a playlist that's pretty much, apart from one song, the entire playlist of the film. And I used to cycle into our office, listening to that playlist, and then we would listen to, as we wrote, we would like listen to the specific songs that were going to be in those scenes and get the tone and the length, the sort of back and forth from it. So yeah, it was absolutely integral. And also, you know, knowing Edgar's work, as a fan of Edgar's work, I knew how important music would be. Although we did occasionally play so much music in the office that people next door would bang on the walls and be like, please stop.
It was when we played Puppet on a String by Sandy Shaw for the third time in a row that the person next door said, please, please turn it down.
And speaking of music, Edgar, I'm blown away by the editing, the fact that, in particular, I'm talking about the first scene where she goes to bed and the red neon, the beat matches the music and the editing. It's mind-boggling.
You just gave me a bit of PTSD because of all the challenging things in the movie. I mean, location filming in Soho and Central London is really challenging. All of the choreography is really challenging. But weirdly, and it's kind of, hopefully it's super slick in the finished thing, but probably the most toughest thing on the set was that we were timing that neon to the music. And
There's
sometimes
like red.
Well, they kind of go, first it's like the French flag, so it goes blue, white, red, blue, white, red. And then as you start to go, it goes red, red, red.
But then also the frame per second also speeds up.
Well, yeah, no, this is the thing. So this is where it became complicated. But so it also is in different frame speeds. So it's like sometimes it's 24, then it goes into 32. Then there's a later section, you're absolutely right, where when you first see the Shadow Men, the red light is speeding up. So we had these things all sequenced, and it was just a lot of work. The trickiest thing was in sequences where the French flag is still going. You sort of had to keep color continuity of the flag. And that was something where me and Paul Matchless, the editor, would be sort of editing on set to sort of just make sure that the continuity didn't go too far off so the color order worked the same way. And so those are the things that, like, when I think about the shoot, is just the thing that gives me PTSD, is thinking about the order of that flag. And sometimes, like, being ready to cue an actor and knowing what color they should start on. And you don't want to bother Diana Rigg with this, but you're kind of like standing by Diana Rigg and waiting and then going blue, white, red, action. So it was a lot of work. And the thing is, because in different frame speeds, and we had them like linked up to the music. So it's sort of like, that's the great thing about having the songs already. There's two forms of that, is that in a way, prior to actually writing the first draft of the screenplay, I would sort of use the songs almost like as post-it notes on the fridge. Must make Last Night in Soho. So every time I heard You're My World or There's a Ghost in My House, I'd be like, oh, I gotta make that movie. Or, and then, like, you know, we had an amazing clearance person, Kirsten Lane, who also did Baby Driver. Clear everything before you start shooting. Like, do not enter into any choreographed sequence if you do not have that song. Like, that's dangerous territory to go into. So then we could sequence the lights with the music, but it was still those things where there's particular bits that it's changing or developing. Let me say, I'm glad you loved it, because it was a fucking nightmare.
Yeah, but I mean, which is a nice segue to my next question, the fact that this film has these incredible set pieces, wow pieces that are incredibly complicated to put together. Is that something that you're saying you had PTSD thinking about it, but is that something that you just get off on, the fact that I'm going to do this very complicated wow pieces?
Yeah, I think that you have to be scared going into a movie, and there's lots of things in this movie that are different from me. There's obviously, like, this serious subject matter is something not to enter into lightly, and that's why, you know, it's really important for us to kind of like sort of do our research and kind of like and honor that. And then obviously lots of production things that, you know, you're going into something really ambitious. Like, you know that, like, shooting in central London and shooting in Soho, the only part of London that's 24/7. If you know, the producers had said to me early on, Edgar, we can't shoot in the real Soho, we have to do it somewhere else, I might not have done the movie. It was so kind of important to me to be in the place, even though I knew it was going to be really difficult. And we were shooting like nights in the summer, and sometimes we have like 6.5 hours of dark to kind of get a sequence. Like, you're making things difficult for yourself. But then I think as a director, you've got to kind of like you got to have a bar that you're not sure whether you can clear or not. You know, that's the thing that I think keeps you kind of like sort of invested. And obviously, you know, it's not like I don't go to work with like without butterflies in my stomach every day. You're not quite sure whether you can pull it off. But I think that's the thing. Otherwise, it's just like if you're just complacent and thinking, oh, I don't know what to do, phone it in. That's not a good feeling. So,
follow-up question about working with Stephen Price, your composer. You not only used the songs as a mood setting or just to introduce the song, the score that Stephen Price built picks up from those songs as well, and also he introduces all the sound effects and words of Anya, Sandy seep in. It's actually crazy psychedelic sound. You know, can you talk about that?
yeah, I mean, this is my fourth film with Stephen Price, and actually, I think we did some of the stuff on Baby Driver, but we decided to take it a bit further with this. Great thing about working with Stephen Price, who was, you know, won an Oscar for Gravity, is that sometimes some composers are sort of a bit precious about their part of the movie, and like sort of like the songs are the songs, but this is the score. And what's great about Steve is that he's as big a fan of pop as I am, so he like loves the idea of working with the songs and how to kind of like take the songs and, you know, he'll start his cue in the key that the last song ended in. Or like there's parts of the movie with the Sandy Shaw track or the Cilla Black track at the end where we sort of create this kind of like, you know, kind of, inversion of the track or something that's getting kind of darker. And then we talked a lot about, yes, having like sort of repeated kind of bits of dialogue. And it's sometimes that with the Sandy Shaw song, which kind of starts normal and then goes very strange as it starts to turn nightmarish, we would sort of say, can we do the Revolution number 9 version of the song?
Wow.
Revolution number 9, which, by the way, even as a kid, as a 6-year-old, using my parents' record player, it would always be the one Beatles track that I would skip. It would absolutely terrify me as a 6-year-old on the White Album, and does to this day, in fact. And so, but that was the idea, and then it was great because the great thing is that I feel really lucky because I've worked with a lot of, even though there are a lot of new people that I work with on this film, Krysty, Odile, Lizzie, Chung Hoon, a lot of the other people, Julian Slater, Paul Matchless, Stephen Price, I've worked with for years. And the great thing about that is that you can all collaborate in the sense of like, we're all working together. It's not like separate departments doing their thing. We're all kind of helping each other in terms of like, let's see what new ideas we can come up with. And so that's great is where Steve Price can take the dialogue from the dialogue editor, Dan Morgan, and put it into the track. And there's one actor actually, Terence Frizzle, who he has like 2 lines, one of which is, so she can sing. And I saw him at the cast and crew the other day, and I said, oh, keep listening to the soundtrack because your line gets repeated throughout the movie. So it's like this thing where you kind of hear these audio samples, you know, in the same way that just like sort of, but to bring that rather than it just be like an echo effect, it's part of the score. I mean, I love all that stuff. The other thing that's interesting with Steve is that he wrote some pieces of music just after reading the script. And like, in fact, that music that you hear on the end credits, he wrote that from reading the script. And then me and Paul had these suites and the stems, and we used that for temp. And sometimes we even played it on set. Like if there was a scary scene, we could play some of Steve's music. I even played it in some of the auditions. So it's sort of amazing to sort of have that kind of communication with people that you've worked with for a long time. And also people who aren't precious and they all want to work together. I think that's what's really important.
And Krysty, the film deals with a lot of joy and bright colors, but also there's a lot of darkness in it. Can you tell us about working in that spectrum of reminding us of nostalgia is good, but then almost the script works as a cautionary tale. Don't be too caught up in nostalgia.
Yeah, I mean, well, nostalgia, I think, is a very dangerous thing because it invites you to live in the past. And also, I think nostalgia is often used, the good old days is often used as a weapon. This idea of like, oh, let's go back to the 60s of the good old days and we had X, Y, and Z. But in the research, I found out the good old days, especially for women, not that great. Like, you can't own property, you know, you can't get divorced, it's legal to beat your wife. And it's like, and as you start to scratch the surface of that, you really begin to understand what it was like to be a woman back then. And then I think also, tragically, a lot of the issues that women faced back then, they still face today. And that, for me, was like quite alarming. And I think, you know, when you're writing a horror film, you should write something that scares you. And that notion of kind of toxic masculinity, I think, is incredibly frightening. And so imbuing that in the script offers all the darkness I think it needed. So then on the balance of that is like trying to understand the lightness. And that's like, you know, giving people hope for the future and giving Ellie a journey that is really tough, but that she ultimately survives and thrives through. And I think that's why the fashion show at the end balances it really nicely. She gets her dreams, she's worked really hard for them. But yeah, it wasn't all rosy.
It's also something that I would have these recurring, like I said, time travel fantasies about going back to the 60s, and then I'd start to wonder why I was thinking about it so much. And then I start to think, oh, am I in retreat? You know, like, is nostalgia a failure to deal with the modern day? And so that, in a way, is where the sort of dream starts to turn into a nightmare as well for me, is that she can't kind of change future events. You know, so she can go back, but she can do nothing to change the future. And so in a way, like, at the end of the movie, it's like the idea is like, there is nothing you can do to change the past. All you can do is deal with the present and moving forward.
Everybody, do not reveal the ending of the movie to your friends. Encourage them to come see the film, but do not reveal the ending. And on that note, thank you so much, Krysty and Edgar, for being here.
Thanks very much.
Love this film.
Thanks for coming out. Beautiful. I've never been in here.
Wow, we were very